Today's episode of Radio Free History is the second half of a long conversation. In our attempt to understand modern art, we take a look at the various French artists of the 19th century, from the academically and classically trained salon artist through the various avant-garde movements, most famously the Impressionists. By the end of the century, the image of the modern artist begins to emerge. Our last conversation was running a little bit long, so we decided to cut it in half and release it as two separate episodes. But if you don't want to go back and watch the previous episode, here's a quick recap. We continued our deep dive into how modern art got the way it is. How did art go from beautiful Renaissance paintings on the walls and ceilings of churches to conceptual art that nobody seems to understand? In fact, everybody seems to think it's ugly, but the critics tell us that we're missing context or we're missing something that's only obvious to them. We noted that on a list of famous French artists, whether it's Monet or Renoir or Gauguin or Cézanne, all of the most famous names seem to have worked between about the 1860s, 1870s, and the early 20th century. We thought that was a little bit weird, seeing as the story of art is 500 years long. One of the clues we had was the 1986 movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where the main characters go explore an art gallery, which seems to be full of continental art, mostly from French artists, between about the 1860s and the 1940s. It seems like whatever our concept of modern art is has gone through a filter of American art galleries and this fairly short list of French avant-garde artists from a relatively short period in time. We explored art in the 18th and 19th century, starting off by looking at British art, starting with Constable and Turner, going through the Pre-Raphaelites, and then some of the other movements in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. And we realized it led us to a bit of a dead end. It was beautiful, but none of it seemed to be the type of art that we saw in the movie Ferris Bueller, or honestly in any contemporary American art gallery. In this half of the conversation, we're taking a step back about 100 years, and we're going to look at what's happening across the channel in France. Hope you enjoy it. So this painting here is a painting by a man named Jacques-Louis David. Now, this painting is clearly in a classical style. I mean, that's not hard to see, right?
Yeah, no, that's definitely.
We associate, at least I associate this style with being kind of stuffy and academic. But David was as revolutionary as it gets. In fact, he plays a role in the French Revolution. He becomes a provisional governor, and he essentially becomes the dictator of art in revolutionary France.
What a title. Modern progressives would do that. They would appoint a dictator of art.
Now, this painting here, it's essentially a call to arms. It's called the Oath of the Herati. It's based on a Roman legend in the writings of Livy, where the Romans chose 3 men to fight 3 men of the enemy city, and these 3 brothers, who were the brothers Herati, they were going to be fighting 3 other brothers called the Curiati. And this is the painting of 3 brothers just making an oath to their father that they're willing to die for the glory of Rome.
Okay.
This was painted 4 years before the storming of the Bastille. But the imagery of state before clan and state before clergy is really going to sum up the French Revolution.
Okay.
What's the moral? What point am I trying to make? Is that the idea that technical art is supposed to be conservative and then playing with the rules and trying to break the rules is revolutionary? Totally false. This painter, he is as revolutionary as anybody gets, and he's using classical imagery to call the people of France to arms.
Yep.
After the French Revolution starts kicking off, he never finishes this. This is what he starts. This is going to be the tennis court oath. If you remember your story of the French Revolution, the Estates General is called, which is there's the nobility, they're the first estate, there's the clergy, the second estate, and everybody else is the third estate. And at one point there's a storm, and the third estate gets locked out, so they convene at a tennis court and say, we're not going to put up with the ruling class's shit anymore. We are going to make an oath that we're not going to stop fighting until we get proper representation. After they got proper representation, they weren't going to stop fighting either. But that's the story of the French Revolution. This painting, David's tennis court oath, it's clearly propaganda. I mean, you even see the curtains blowing in at the top. Like I said, this event happens during a storm, but that's supposed to be like a religious omen. The storm is coming in. It blows all sorts of the energy of an electrical storm.
Change.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, it's a good way to put it. Why? For such a great piece of propaganda, why does this piece never get finished? Because it doesn't take very long before a lot of the people portrayed in this painting end up 8 inches shorter.
Oh, so this was a unpersoning event.
Well, I mean, the unpersoning doesn't happen until a few years after this, but something that should have been emblematic of the French Republic, of the French people casting off the monarchy and ushering in a new enlightened idea of reason, it really didn't take very long to go sour.
Yeah. Usually revolutions don't turn out very well.
Yeah.
There's been very few examples of like happy revolutions that ended in...
David Starkey says he has an ironclad law of revolutions, which is that all of the worst excesses of the old order, they're going to be made even worse after the revolution.
Yep. Sorry, Arab Spring. That's what history has, what history has, man.
Again, if you remember your French Revolution, this is Marat. This is probably one of David's most famous paintings. Marat, he was a guy who, I can't remember if he ran a newspaper or if he was just a pamphleteer, but he was one of the biggest fanatics out there. He had some sort of skin condition, so he had to spend all of his time in the bathtub. And a woman named Charlotte Corday thought this guy was so fanatical that he had betrayed the revolution, so she decided to take it on herself to go visit him at his house and plunge a knife into him.
You guys, if a guy can't leave the bathtub because he's covered in sores, I think, what are you going to do at that point?
Yeah.
Just let him pamphlet?
Well, it backfired clearly because this allowed David to paint the guy as the martyr for the cause. Always remember, if you're trying to be part of a revolution, don't create martyrs.
Yeah.
But you'll notice something about the style of this art is that everything else that David painted before this time was in the old traditional style. This is in a very different art style. This is supposed to represent turning over a new leaf and the more rational age of reason coming in. You don't need to have all of this adornment in the background. It's fine to have just a black wall.
Yeah.
In fact, it's almost it's still a debate among art historians. Is that supposed to be his wall, or is that supposed to be some sort of negative black space, which is supposed to symbolize something?
Maybe he just didn't finish it.
Yeah. So now again, if you remember your history of the French Revolution, you'll know of a guy named Robespierre.
Oh, this guy.
He gets a lot of people's heads cut off. He accuses a lot of people, sends a lot of people to the guillotine.
Well, he had to create an equitable society based on reason, so you have to kill a lot of people to do that, as it turned out.
Robespierre, eventually things catch up with him. He gets accused of acting outside the law.
Pay attention, guys.
Now, David, again, he's a provisional governor. He is the dictator of art in the revolutionary government in the First Republic of France. And he tells Robespierre that I will drink the hemlock as well. I will follow you to the guillotine. So the next day, when Robespierre is going to the guillotine, you would think that David is going to show up. No, he doesn't.
Jesus Christ. Pay attention,
Yeah,
revolutionaries.
yeah. The lemmings who you expect to follow you off the cliff as you're becoming a martyr, a lot of them won't show up.
Yep. A lot of people going to say they ride for you, but they're not going to ride for you.
So David, he escapes the guillotine. He ends up in jail, but at least he keeps his head. What's he gonna do? Is he gonna go back to this crazy revolutionary lifestyle? No, he decides to lay low for a little bit and become a portrait painter.
Smart guy.
But it doesn't take very long before you have a guy you might have heard of called Napoleon Bonaparte.
Oh, yeah.
And David, he was willing to be a propagandist for the revolutionary government. He's perfectly happy to be a propagandist for Napoleon as well.
Oh, wow.
He paints this painting, which is the coronation of Napoleon, as he crowns himself emperor. Notice how he's putting the crown on his own head here.
What a beautiful painting.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
This is a painting of Napoleon, which I know we've all seen.
That's iconic.
Yeah. This is also painted by David.
Okay.
So again, he's clearly well connected. He makes the leading propaganda of the era, but he knows which side the bread is buttered on. When it's time to support the revolution, he supports the revolution. When it's time to support the emperor, all hail Napoleon.
Yep.
David is one of the two important painters we need to look at in the early 19th century. Sorry. The other important continental painter, he's not French, he's Spanish. It's a guy named Francisco Goya. He was in the King's Court in Spain. He was definitely one of the old masters, but he was a contemporary of David, and he was in Spain. Now, we've spoken about this in a couple of other episodes as well. What did Napoleon do when he went into Spain?
Nothing good
No.
for the Spanish.
He put his brother in charge. He deposed the Spanish monarchy. He put his brother in charge, and it became known as his ulcer. It was because the Spanish militia groups really didn't want to play along with this. They didn't want to bow down to a Bonaparte.
And all the Spanish colonies became orphans.
That they did.
And they never really learned to govern themselves.
No. That, we have a couple episodes on that as well, if you want to look at our episodes in Mexico. And the idea of guerrilla warfare, that's something that's going to come back in Spain a little over a century later.
Yep.
As David is making propaganda praising Napoleon across the Pyrenees in Spain, you have this kind of propaganda. This is the French putting down a rebellion in Spain. It's called the 2nd of May, 1808. And you'll notice something about this. The French don't look terribly French.
No, and the Spanish don't look terribly Spanish.
Well, now the Spanish are supposed to look somewhat accurate, but the French are supposed to look like invading barbarians.
Yeah.
And there's maybe a different ethnicity that the Spanish prefer to use to represent invading barbarians.
Yeah, that would be a reasonable extrapolation.
So some people say this painting is really the first work of modern art where a painter is willing to take an artistic liberty like that, turning the Napoleon's invading French army into a bunch of Arabs.
Yeah.
Now, he didn't just make this painting. This was actually half of a set of two. This is the 2nd of May. He also does the 3rd of May. This is a very famous painting in Spain. Now, just like in the last one, he decides to take some artistic license and make the French into the Saracens.
Okay.
It's not immediately obvious, but there's a couple of conventions that are being broken in this painting. Can you see what they might be?
Conventions.
And just to give you some context. The previous one was the 2nd of May when the guerrillas decided to give Napoleon's troops hell. This is the 3rd of May, the day after, when Napoleon's guys got in charge of the situation again and decided to put everybody in front of a firing squad. Can you see anything about this painting that might buck some convention?
There's a black guy.
There's some quite swarthy Spanish people. I don't think it's that.
It's not quite meant to be a black guy. Everybody's got their eyes covered in the background.
Well, the guy who's being shot, he's on his knees. Look how, if he were to stand up, he'd be like 10 feet tall.
Yeah, he'd be a giant. They'd have to kill him.
Now, in Renaissance painting, this is something you would do. You'd make Jesus much bigger than everybody else. This is just one of the guerrilla fighters who was fighting for an independent Spain, but Goya has decided to make him a giant, bigger than everybody else, using almost religious imagery for him. Another thing that's less obvious, but still in the religious vein, again, remember in Renaissance paintings, which is all very religious in nature, if somebody was a saint, you'd put a halo over their head, or you'd at least put some sort of light surrounding him.
Yeah.
There is light surrounding this guy.
Yeah.
It's light coming from the lantern to light him up so he's going to get shot. There's nothing holy. There's nothing good about the light here. So it's kind of a complete inversion of that convention. But again, he's supposed to be the holy figure being Jesus. Also, he's got his arms out. That's a very clearly religious allegory as well. But, this is just supposed to be some random guy, some random unknown rebel in Spain. And Goya is using all of the Renaissance conventions about Jesus to portray him in this painting. So again, this painting and the previous one was the 2nd of May, this was the 3rd of May. It's a set of two. But collectively, some people would say this is where modern art starts. What point am I trying to make, though, is that you've got David in France, who is the more revolutionary artist. He is the guy who is part of the revolution to overthrow the old French monarchy and usher in something new. His style of painting is more academic. Goya, the guy who is loyal to Spain and more conservative and nationalistic, the style of his painting, he bucks conventions. He's willing to break the rules. The idea that modern art is supposed to be something radical and progressive and just breaking the rules for its own sake, that's just not true at all. The conservative guy is the one who's breaking the rules, and the guy who's literally part of the French Revolution is the guy who's painting pictures of old Romans.
Not what you would expect.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like this story that art history professors tell us that as time goes on, artists are more and more willing to break the rules, and eventually the forward-looking ones, they just give up beauty altogether. That's just not what we're seeing here. It's not what we saw with the Pre-Raphaelites. They were much more realistic than Turner was, and it's not what we're seeing when we compare David and Goya. So the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, they define the careers of the two most mentioned artists in any documentary of the story of art. If they talk about the early 19th century, they talk about Constable and Turner in England, and they talk about Goya and David on the continent. Both clearly talented, But in both cases, their skill is not the reason we remember them. We remember them for what they painted about the world around them. Like, we remember them because they are crucial in getting an image of this time in history, of the Napoleonic Wars. Art history profs, they like to talk about this artistic movement or this artist really having an influence on that artist, etc., etc. The black turtleneck type. I think that's just bullshit. Like, who had an artistic influence on Goya? Who cares? You'll learn more about this painting by understanding what was going on in the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, and so, really said something about the culture, represented something important to people.
Yeah.
Capture an image, as you said.
Well, not just what's important to people, what was going on in history. There was no photojournalism back in the day. So if the two most famous continental artists, their careers are defined by the historical events of the day, as opposed to by their own skill. I'm not saying that they weren't skilled, but like, you can't understand David without understanding the French Revolution, and you can't understand Goya without understanding the Napoleonic Wars. Let's take a look at what's going on in France over the next several decades. Because, like I said before, we want to understand why all the paintings in Ferris Bueller, why they were all late 19th century and mostly French painters. Again, and also remember, you don't, other than Constable and Turner, you don't really see a lot of British artists on the Jeopardy list. You see Monet, Renoir, Manet, Gauguin, Cézanne, Duchamp, Magritte. Magritte is Belgian, not French, but same shit. So if all of these famous artists are French, let's see what's happening in the history of France over this period, because maybe it'll give us some clues as to why those artists are the famous ones. There are countless documentaries on YouTube of French artists in the 19th century, but they're all framed the same way. So this art movement had one famous artist, and he influenced all the artists after that. And some pretentious professor comes on, gets interviewed, and talks about how, oh, you can truly see the influence of this artist or this old master. When I look at the history of art in France in the 19th century, I can't help but notice that almost every single one of these pioneering artworks, they happen at a time when France has a huge change in its government. France in the 19th century should have had one of those signs that says like X years since the last revolution that you pull down.
They still kick off every once in a while.
Yeah. Well, they still have riots. I don't think they have full-on revolutions anymore. But you don't just have the revolutions in France. Think about it. You have Napoleon, and then you have another Napoleon later on. And you have Waterloo, and you have the British overthrowing them, and then you have the Franco-Prussian War. In fact, France has 9 changes of government over this period. 9. I don't mean like 9 elections where they elect a new president. I mean where they just get rid of the old system of government altogether and replace it with something new.
That sounds like a lot of instability.
Yeah. Any undergraduate history class on 19th century European history will go over this stuff, and it's all available on YouTube, so I'm not going to go over all of French history because I just don't have the time for that here. But I am going to make a quick list of every time France changes its government. First of all, you have the storming of the Bastille. You have the OG French Revolution. They cut off the king and queen's heads. They cut off a lot of each other's heads. At one point, you end up with 5 people in charge called the Directory, who try one last time to make it work, but they have some military losses, and then Napoleon gets essentially conscripted to overthrow the Directory in a coup d'etat. And a few years later, in 1804, he says, you know what? This isn't working. Fuck it. Let's just get rid of the whole government and make me the emperor. How about that? How does that work? This is the next government, the First Empire.
Saddam Hussein.
Pretty much. Then 10 years later, in 1814, he falls at Leipzig and he's exiled to Elba, and the Bourbons are restored very, very briefly. But the next year, in 1815, he escapes Elba. He overthrows the king again, and he restores the empire, but just for 100 days. Eventually, he literally has his Waterloo. He falls for good. He gets sent not to Elba, but to some really remote, depressing island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where some people think the British were just giving him arsenic.
Well, apparently they studied his hair.
Yep. Yeah, I've heard that
There's
too.
arsenic in there, so.
So the Bourbons are restored yet again. Louis XVIII is the restored monarch. He is on his best behavior. The problem is when he kicks the bucket and his brother Charles X becomes king, he decides to be more conservative, and he says, you know what, if all this revolutionary stuff doesn't work, why don't we just bring back the old way of doing things before the revolution? And then in 1830, you get the events described in Les Miserables, where the...
You can hear the people sing.
Yeah, people sing about red and black, and the color of despair.
Napoleon widened the streets.
Basically, yes. So, Les Mis happens. He's Charles X is replaced with his cousin Louis Philippe. He's a constitutional monarch, and all of the academics think that France has finally established an enlightened system of government. Why do they think this after 40 years of constant turmoil? Academics just have a bad habit of reading too much into things. If you look at what happened in England, is that the English beat the French to cutting off their king's head. His name was Charles I. You had a king who had his head cut off, Charles I and Louis XVI. You had a total shit show, which was the revolutionary government, or the government of Oliver Cromwell in England.
Yep.
You had a restoration of the monarchy, which was Charles II and Louis XVIII, where people were kind of happy. They were on their best behavior. Then both of them died, and their brothers were put in charge. In England, it was James II, who decided, you know what, I'm going to be a Catholic. That led to a revolution. It led to the Glorious Revolution in England, and England brought in William of Orange and brought in their limited constitutional monarchy, which they still kind of have to this day. France thought that after going through essentially that exact same sequence of events, we just had Les Miserables. We brought in a constitutional monarch. We brought in Louis Philippe. He's going to be our William of Orange. Finally, we've reached the end of the line the same way that the English did. No.
Uh-oh.
Then comes 1848, when every country across Europe demands some sort of democratic reform.
I was just talking about the Arab Spring. This
Yeah,
is the European.
yeah.
This is
The 1848 is totally the European Arab
European
Spring.
Spring.
Now, most of these revolutions across Europe fail, even though they do get a few capitulations here and there, a few democratic reforms. But in France, Louis Philippe abdicates and flees the country, and the Second Republic is established in 1848. So France is now a free nation again, quote unquote free. The people are governing themselves, and who do they elect? Well, they elect Napoleon's nephew.
So Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. Well, Napoleon III, he has an agenda. It's ambitious. He wants to put some of his ideas in place, but he has some of these pesky Republicans and monarchists who are still around. They oppose him. And also, France put in place a new constitution that doesn't allow him to run for re-election. So 3 years into it, he says, fuck this. I'm going to just dissolve the National Assembly and give myself dictatorial powers. He frames it as being necessary, but then he puts a plebiscite to the country and said, "Are you guys happy with me being dictator? Yeah, okay, you're happy with me being dictator. I'm dictator." And to be honest, it really doesn't get much resistance.
Yeah.
Because after your country's had like 7 or 8 changes of government after this point, people just
want
sure, you guys do whatever you want.
some kind of order needs to be established.
This establishes something called Bonapartism. It's just the idea that people view it as a democracy, but you really have a dictator in charge who says, "I'm doing stuff in the name of the people, but we're doing things my way."
Yeah, he claims essentially dictator steps in and says, "I can represent the will of the people better than the parliament." You know, it's like it's one thing like a Trump essentially.
Yeah. Well, but this guy puts the crown on his own head, and he reigns for 20 years until the Germans roll in.
Oops.
And not for the last time either.
Nope. It's going to be a theme.
So yeah, the Franco-Prussian War happens. Napoleon III is deposed, and if you're keeping score, this is 3-3-3. 3 revolutions in 1789, 1830, 1848. 3 times a foreign military deposes the government in 1814, 1815, and 1871. And 3 times somebody just declares himself emperor. 1799, 1815, and 1851. 9 changes in government between the French Revolution and the Franco-Prussian War.
Jesus Christ.
And just like I'm saying, when I look at art history, I don't see a lot of, this brilliant artist influenced that brilliant artist. I see a series of, hey, this artist managed to sell a painting right at the time that France overthrew its government.
Yeah.
And that painting became famous for that reason. And I almost think that art history is a misnomer. It's just history.
Yeah, it's all tied in. Real art is, always dependent on what technology is being done and what's going on politically. It's all tied in together. It's just... It's how it should be taught, but it's almost never taught that way.
And we will look at some of these famous artists just in a second, but there's one other question that we need to ask. Maybe France has its own culture that we don't know about in the way that Quebec does, because like Quebec has almost its own Hollywood. There's Quebec movies that nobody ever watches.
Yeah, they have their own culture.
France has its own art culture that nobody knows about outside of France, and good for them.
Yeah, but France pays for France's art.
Yes. Yeah. But when you think about all of the famous French artists on that list, the Impressionists, like your Monet and your Cézanne and all those people, they all really become famous after the 1870s, after the Franco-Prussian War. So why is that as well? So we're just going to take a quick look at French art in the 19th century and just answer those questions. Just as the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars were the 2 inflection points that gave us David's most famous works, the next inflection point was 1830, when, like I said, Les Miserables. So what happens in the art world around the time of Les Miserables? Is there one famous artist whose career is defined by that revolution? Well, you bet there is. His name is Eugène Delacroix. Art history professors are going to tell you that he broke the mold since he didn't paint in the neoclassical style. Like, this doesn't look like David's paintings of all the Roman guys. But he also didn't really look that different than Goya did, so I don't think he really broke the mold that much. This is just typical of the Romantic era. He had a different, it didn't look like the classical style, but he was still painting scenes from mythology or from literature or from the Bible. He just did it in whatever the style of the day happened to be. He did spend some time in London as a young man, so he did get to see the British do Shakespeare, and he actually did quite a number of Shakespearean paintings. For example, here you have a scene from Hamlet, and I can't remember, the one on the left, the one on the left is Desdemona. Oh, okay. It's Othello.
Some really artsy-fartsy types. They talk about how he pioneered the use of color, and read as much as you want into that if you want. As best as I can tell, he was just a really talented painter who happened to paint in the prevailing style of his day. So why is he considered the seminal artist of his era? That's the painting. You've seen that painting, right? Oh, yeah. If you've seen any production of Les Miserables, that painting is probably on it. Yep. Liberty leading the masses, liberty being a topless woman.
Yep, because France.
Yeah. Just as in England, just as there's the Royal Academy in England, there's the Academy of Fine Arts, l'Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And this academy, for everything else in France that gets completely overthrown, the Academy of Art is fairly constant. And in 1831, so the year after the Revolution, their Salon, which is their big, which is the French Academy's big art exhibition where they try to sell art every year, to commemorate the king being overthrown, they tell all their artists, just paint something that represents the new France. And the new king, Louis Philippe, he shows up to the art show and says, I'm going to buy this painting right here. Wow. So like 12 people decide to make a painting representing the new France. The king says, I'm going to buy this one, and that's why Delacroix is considered the key figure in French art in the 1830s. Is it because he was more talented than everybody else? I don't fucking know. It's just this painting.
The king liked it.
Yeah, the king liked this painting, and that's it.
It's like getting retweeted by somebody, I guess.
Yeah. You know, he does other things in his life, but he's just now remembered as the defining artist of the era that moved from the neoclassical style into the romantic style. So we now move to the next pioneering artist, Gustave Courbet.
Okay.
This is a self-portrait. I've met a lot of dipshit artists in Toronto who look like this guy.
Yeah, this is a familiar scene if you've worked in the annex.
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell from looking at this self-portrait that the guy is 5'6".
Yeah, he's a little dude.
Now, again, there's an official story about this guy. That official story is that he turns his back on the Romantic movement and he starts focusing on painting more realistic subjects. And this movement is called, unsurprisingly, realism.
Okay.
So let's
delivers what it says, I guess. That's laudable.
Yeah, let's look at it. You know, okay. Just like the English are painting landscapes, he paints some landscapes as well. In fact, I think he was influenced by Constable. I think Constable, if I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, I think Constable came over to Paris for a little bit and exhibited some of his landscape paintings, and it affected Courbet. But just the important thing is Delacroix, he was still painting the historical paintings or the literary paintings. Courbet just says, I'm not going to be constrained by any of that stuff. I'm going to paint something from real life. Another one of his works, this one, People at Work. It's nice. It's called The Wheat Sifters.
That's just okay.
But, there's nothing, this is not a painting of something higher. This is not a famous painting, a famous scene from literature or anything like that. This is just French people at work.
Yeah, wheat.
And this is what realism is supposed to be. This is what's going on in the world, so let's paint it.
Okay. Well, laudable. I like that. Trying to connect with reality.
But, once again, that's the official story of Courbet. He's a guy who, the official story is that, I'm not going to be the stuffy academic type. I'm going to paint something realistic. I'm going to be the guy who pioneers realism. You can't help but notice that this guy becomes famous and sells his most famous works right at the time of the 1848 revolution.
Yeah.
I'm not cherry picking, folks. You saw my Google search earlier when I looked for famous French artists. There were only 2 famous French artists from like before the end of the 19th century. There was Delacroix and there was Courbet. And they both sold their famous art right after France had a revolution to overthrow their government.
Yeah.
I can't help but notice that. There are a couple of important French thinkers of this era as well. One guy is Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. He's the original trust fund kid. He is the father of anarchism. He is the guy who says, la propriété, c'est le vol. Property is theft. That's the dipshit who that comes from.
The anarchists have a long and hilarious history that we will have to dig into at some point. It's interesting that this is the...
They killed the U.S. president as well.
Oh,
They
wow.
killed McKinley.
Jesus Christ.
He, again, just like a true trust fund kid, Proudhon believes that culture should be focused on the rural poor, who he probably never ever met.
He has an idealized,
Yeah.
concept of what they are.
Yeah. But he also writes a book called Du principe de l'art et de sa destination sociale, like on the principles of art and the social destination. we think of these artistic, insufferable bohemians as being a type that's been around forever. No, this comes from this period.
Yep.
Now, Courbet is friends with Proudhon, and Proudhon has Courbet's ear, and he convinces Courbet to paint some stuff that is supposed to have a message, but really it's supposed to have his message. Another important thinker of the day is Charles Baudelaire, who is a poet and critic who writes a lot about the modern world and beauty and decadence. And Baudelaire believes that art should be about modern life, especially post-1848. I don't know if you've heard the term flaneur. That's like the traveling artist, the troubadour who just travels from city to city and observes things. They kind of like the hipster, only if the hipster actually had talent.
It calls back to like the aesthetic.
Yeah, kind of.
Wandering freaking monk creature.
Yeah, kind of.
Something, a theory, something.
Yeah. In France, they call that le flaneur, the flaneur. But that term is coined by Baudelaire. And Baudelaire, he's big in French high society, and he praises Courbet. And we'll see this going forward, where you can't just talk about the artist; you have to talk about the critic who's promoting him as well.
Yeah.
Try writing about 20th century cinema without mentioning Roger Ebert or Harvey Weinstein.
Yep. No, absolutely.
But like I said, Courbet is known for really 3 paintings, and 2 of them are sold during the Second Republic, which is that brief period between the 1848 revolution and Napoleon III crowning himself. And let's be very clear here. These works have more to do with that than any of his own ideas. The first is called The Artist's Studio. It's pretentious. It's him painting himself painting. It's supposed to be realistic and unvarnished, and it's viewed as subversive and vulgar, but more importantly, it's viewed as the death of Romanticism.
Okay.
Another one of his paintings is this one, A Burial at Ornans. Now, Ornans is his hometown. You'll notice it's not The Burial at Ornans, which is what it would be probably if it was a previous artist done it. If an older artist had done a painting like this, it would have shown a priest addressing the masses, and the priest would have been elevated. You'll notice that the clergy here, they're just part of the crowd.
Yeah,
There's, they look realistic, but they're not distinguished from anybody else here. It's controversial for that reason, that the religious figures are not distinguished in any way, and this is the painting that Baudelaire really praises for its authenticity. Because again, the hipsters then sound like hipsters now.
Yeah, makes sense.
And the other one that Courbet does is this one. It's called The Stonebreakers. And again, it's supposed to be realistic, and it's supposed to be a realistic and unvarnished view of the working class. Did this guy ever meet the working class? Just take a look at his self-portrait a few slides ago.
It's a strange looking hammer. Doesn't look like a sledgehammer that I'd ever know.
But we also see one other thing, though, and that's that painting is starting to have a bit of an aspect of showmanship to it.
Yeah.
At one point, you would join the academy and you try to show your stuff to the church or to the king or some nobles, and if they didn't buy your shit, tough. Courbet is the first guy to say, fuck this, I'm self-promoting. Why didn't anybody do this before? Well, there just wasn't enough of a market for it. Like I said, this is the Industrial Revolution, when you have more bourgeois wealth out there and you have people who have earned their fortune in the newly industrialized society. They can afford to go to art shows and buy this stuff. So Courbet starts promoting himself, but nobody before him really could have done this. I mean, they could have, but it would have just been a waste of time. He's after that good old bourgeois money. Michelangelo wasn't selling to the fishmonger.
Yeah, that's fair.
Before I'm done talking about Courbet and his realism, I just need to bring up one more piece of art talking about realism and showmanship. This is called The Origin of the World.
Jesus Christ, what the fuck?
You saw the self-portrait of the guy. He looked like a 5'6" manlet. Modern hipster. Modern hipsters would do something like this.
Yeah, that's fair. This is exploitative.
He calls it The Origin of the World. I had to put the little YouTube censorship thing here.
Good for you. Good for you. This is...
This is a guy who's trying to shock so he can sell his own work.
Makes sense.
This is the Marilyn Manson of his day.
Well, this is, I'm reminded of, like, back before pornography was available to everybody.
Yeah.
They had to make, like, movies that were, like, erotica.
Yep.
That were, like, so this is, I get the same thing, as you say, he's selling this as something to take home and be titillating with, but...
Yep.
He's got to dress it up as art. So.
I think he's also trying to find where the real line is.
Let me do it.
So, just as Delacroix was the guy who represented the 1830 revolution and Courbet was synonymous with the 1848 revolution, we're going to now look at the age of Napoleon III. Now, this is a period of relative stability, especially by French standards. Like you said, he's the emperor for 20 years. And once again, the defining artist of the era is going to represent that stability.
Okay.
That artist is Edouard Manet, not Monet, Manet. They're two different artists, M-A-N-E-T. Before Napoleon III, Courbet was a political radical. After Napoleon III, you have the Impressionists working in a very different environment, which we'll get to very soon. Manet was just a guy who was happy to work inside the academy. So,
obviously.
Well, I'm just saying, like, all this bullshit about how this artist kicked off this movement and affected the bullshit. You look at the political situation in France in this period, it tells you a lot more about the art of the period than any of that bullshit does.
Exactly.
Now, this is Manet's most famous painting. It's called The Luncheon on the Grass. And we'll talk about it in a second, but we need to get some cultural context first. Just as Courbet was a political radical, and after Napoleon III, you have the Impressionists working in a very different environment, which we'll talk about very soon. Manet is a guy who works inside the academy. France has a unusual period of stability for about 20 years, and that's represented by the most famous artist of the day being a guy who is going to do things differently, but he's also not going to make too many waves. Again, you have a famous art critic championing the guy, just like Courbet was championed by Baudelaire. Emile Zola, who you might recognize as the guy who wrote the J'accuse editorial during the Dreyfus affair. He is he is a prominent critic of the day, and he's going to be the guy who champions Monet. Okay. He's one of the reasons why Monet makes a name for himself. Though, interestingly enough, Monet is maybe not as famous in his day as you'd think. He's talented, certainly, but there's lots of talented people working inside the French Academy whose art is now hanging in the Louvre.
And nobody freaking knows who they are.
Yep.
So you walk by him on the way to see something famous.
Yeah. Monet is kind of the first of the, let's call him the Jeopardy artists, the artists whose names come up on Jeopardy time and time again. And that's kind of because the story of art history, the official story of art history, starts with him. Why does it start with him? Because the artists who are making hideous eyesores nowadays, if you just work backwards, they say we were affected by Andy Warhol, and professors say Warhol was affected by Pollock, and then Pollock was affected by Duchamp, etc., etc. And they kind of come back to this painting here on the screen. But I don't know if Monet was all that famous in his day. I think it was just after the fact. Professors talk about his importance. No disrespect toward him, though. In 1863, the story of art, as art professors know it, begins. Why? Because there's a famous art show that year. That year, there were so many works of art submitted to the Salon, the official art exhibition, that there were a lot of works rejected, and Napoleon III agrees that he's going to have a separate art exhibition just of the rejected works called the Salon de Refusés, the Salon of Refuse.
Jesus.
So even as late as the 1860s, the monarch is playing a role in the art world, in what's allowed to become good art and what isn't.
Shows you the cultural importance of a monarch.
Yep. Oh, totally. This painting you see on the screen, the Luncheon on the Grass, is arguably the most famous painting to come out of that show. Now, what do you notice about it? Can you see anything that stands out?
I'm noticing boob.
Yeah.
I'm noticing two kind of swarthy guys near the naked girl.
Well,
some nice looking buns at the bottom of the figure.
Well, here's the thing. If it was a painting out of mythology and it was like the goddess Venus who was naked, that's an old classical work of art. That's an old classical painting. Nobody would think that was unusual. This is supposed to be set in the modern day. Yeah. And what does it mean when everybody is dressed in modern dress and there's a naked woman?
Yeah, that's, I don't know.
There's something suspicious about this.
Yeah, I don't like where this is going. This has a weird vibe to what might happen.
So it's realistic. The naked woman is of questionable repute. It's modern, as Baudelaire said art should be. But there's another thing you might not notice. If you see the woman in the river at the back. Now, Monet is clearly a talented artist. He knows how to work with perspective and everything. But that woman in the back, if she were to stand up, she'd probably be 12 feet tall.
Giantess.
Yeah. Like, it's not that Monet doesn't know what he's doing. He clearly knows what he's doing. He clearly is technically proficient, but he's willing to break rules. He's willing to break rules. He's willing to break from tradition, but he's also not really going to be so radical that he makes too many waves at the outside the academy, in and outside the academy.
Okay. He knew where to stay away from the real line.
Yeah. Oh, he wasn't painting very realistic paintings of a woman's vagina.
Yeah. Like, oh God.
Though he did make some waves, though. One example is this painting called Olympia.
Yeah, this is like that movie with Susan Sarandon about the underage girl at the whorehouse.
Yeah. Well, also, we took Aunt Jemima off the maple syrup bottles in 2020 because it was an offensive racial stereotype. This painting would have been canceled.
Yeah, seriously. This is not passing a modern test of propriety.
Now, you might need a little bit of context, though, because, like I said, Manet is a guy working inside the academy, and this is an homage to a classical or to a Renaissance work of art. It's based on Titian's Venus of Urbino, but whereas that was a Roman goddess, Venus in a glamorous nude shot. This is a modern French woman with a black cat, so it has a slightly different connotation. Another painting done by Manet, this one here. Now, clearly this is an homage to Goya's 3rd of May, which we just showed a little while ago. That was some rebels getting killed by a firing squad. This is Emperor Maximilian getting shot. We still have another couple episodes to do on Mexico. We did the first 2, 4 hours of runtime, and it's nothing but, Mexico just keeps becoming more of a shit show.
If you're looking for hope and progress, don't look to the Spanish colonies.
No. So what happened? We'll do another episode on that. We'll get to Emperor Maximilian, but the TLDR is that after decades and decades and decades of infighting and civil wars and political instability, they say, hey, we should bring in a European monarch to run the country. That'll give us stability. So they brought in a Habsburg who decided he wanted to be an enlightened liberal despot. And that's not what you need to run a country like Mexico.
No, it's not what you need to run the Mexican party, for sure.
No. So, he tried that for a few years and was promptly put in front of a firing squad, and that's what Manet is showing here. Another one of his paintings, The Absinthe Drinker. Why is this important? It's because there's absolutely nothing literary or academic about this. This is a French drunk at a bar in the 1860s, and that's what he was going to paint.
Drinking his hallucinogenic drink.
Yeah. Another thing you'll see is things like train stations. This is the Industrial Revolution. The train stations are something completely new. And things like that gave artists completely new subject matter to paint about. But they didn't necessarily do it in a realistic way. You see these broad brush strokes showing the steam of a steam engine.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, how they were interpreting these new technologies.
Yep. And finally, this is probably the last famous painting that he did.
The lesbian bartender?
It's not a lesbian. It's the bartenders were selling other services in those days.
Prostitute.
Yep. Oh, totally. But again, just like there was the woman in the river who would have been 12 feet tall, there's another thing that doesn't quite work out as far as the laws of physics go in this painting, and there's actually a mirror behind her. You see her reflection, but it's not straight.
Yeah.
The guy in the top hat is buying her services.
Oh, okay.
And so it's saying, like, are you the guy who's paying this whore? Can you imagine if bartenders were whores now?
Yeah, that would be what a world that would be. I was spared a lot of trouble with bartenders because I worked door, so I didn't have as much interaction with the staff usually. But oh god, some of the things that happened.
Yeah, just like you had the giant woman in the other one who screws up the work the rules of perspective. The fact that there's a mirror behind her, but the angles are funny. Again, Monet is just willing to do stuff like this. Just say, yes, it's not realistic. This would not, if you took a photograph, it wouldn't work out. But who cares? Yeah, who cares? This painting is kind of important as well. It's called the Balcony. Can you think of why this painting might be important from an art historical point of view, or at least from the pretentious art historian's point of view? Can you think of why this painting might be important?
The first time we're seeing Japanese people, I think.
Okay, that's actually that wasn't where I was going with that, but yeah, Japan had just opened up to the world after the Americans sent a bunch of gunboats, so a lot of Japanese art made it to the West. And
speaking of a firm hand,
well, one of the funny things about all these French artists of the time, if they were alive today, they would be weebs. They would be anime fans. There was a huge fetish for Japanese aesthetics then.
Autistic's gonna autistic. It doesn't matter what century.
But now the thing that is maybe a little bit new in this painting is just look at the black background behind this guy. There's almost no depth here, and they just use the black background to hide that. So as you look at 20th century paintings, people like Picasso, the depth starts disappearing. They start saying, you know what? We have photographs now. We have photography. Why do paintings need to be realistic depictions of the world? If everything is going to be painted, why not do something that's suited for a two-dimensional image? And so you start seeing depth being no longer as important as it used to be, and this painting is an early version of that. There's not really a lot of depth, but he kind of hides that by the fact that there's a huge black background behind him.
It's like two-dimensional.
Yeah. So now we come to the Franco-Prussian War, and this once again interrupts art in France, and it deposes Napoleon III. And for a brief period, a group of radicals established the Paris Commune as an insurrection. The government relocates to Versailles and sends in the army to crush these ne'er-do-wells. And one of the scapegoats was our old friend Gustave Courbet. That's the 5'6" manlet guy, the guy who was into showmanship and self-promotion.
Sorry, homie. Sometimes that don't work.
Well, he's involved in this new proto-communist revolutionary government.
And the wrong horse.
One of the things he does is he's involved in the destruction of the Vendôme column. This column is made from cannons that were melted down when Napoleon would invade countries.
Jesus Christ. They always go right for art.
Monuments. Yep. You know, he says, "Oh, it's a symbol of imperialism," because of course, they don't like imperialism. Since the 1870s, you don't see any new ideas of these people.
It's the same thing.
You know, they had a rot up their ass about this column because it represented Napoleon's victories, and I'm sure a 5'6" manlet.
He's gonna be upset about this.
He's arrested. He's forced to pay for the repair. He can't afford it, so he's forced to live in exile. So he moves to Switzerland for the rest of his life.
As they do.
But, you know, a number of young artists react to the Franco-Prussian War differently. Some fight. Some are killed in action. Some go to London during the war, including Monet. But this is where we really get the linchpin in every black turtleneck latte sipping art critic's history story, Impressionism. Now, much has been said about Impressionism. YouTube is filled with lectures and documentaries about how the Impressionists were radicals overthrowing the art world, and eventually they became so commonplace that every gift bag at an art gallery has some Impressionist painting on it, like a Monet or a Renoir or something. It's not all bullshit, but it's mostly bullshit, that story. The true part of this story is that the Impressionists were really the first art movement to get coverage in the newspapers at the time, to the extent that, they were minor celebrities in their day.
Okay, it's a public profile now for these guys.
But, even then it's largely exaggerated, and I think a lot of it is post hoc justified. Like some of this is nice art. I'm not saying it isn't. This is by Bazille, this is by Monet. Here's some of its nice looking art, but it's also kind of like IQ 105 art.
Yeah, this is if this was coming out of like a grade 8 class, I'd be very proud of it. But this is not.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily museum worthy.
No. Also, you got to remember one thing about the Impressionists is that they lived in Paris at a time when essentially the old city was torn down and replaced with a new city with its parks and its wide streets, which are just a little too wide to build barricades.
Yeah, sorry, guys.
Paris becomes, it's an industrial city of smokestacks and train stations like Monet did. And it doubles in population in just 20 years.
Oh, like Toronto.
So, anytime you hear an art historian talking about how the artists from this period are radical, are these people changing things, or are they just artists at a time when the whole world is changing because of industrialization? Like, ask yourself, if you were an artist in New York City in the 70s versus an artist in New York City during the Giuliani days, would your art look different?
Yep.
And on a micro level as well, it's not just changes to society at large. On a micro level, changes in technology allow artists to do something different. Like, you associate Impressionism with thick brush strokes. Well, like the ferrule, the metal thing that holds the bristles in place on a brush, that's a new invention. You couldn't have a flat head brush until this period.
The medium is the message.
Yep. Another thing that you think of is, the landscape with broad strokes and bright colors that are maybe not realistic. These people didn't make that up. Turner did that in England 60 years before. But the idea of the French artist who goes out to the countryside, sets up his easel, paints something, goes, and sells it, that happens now, but it wasn't really possible up until this point, because first of all, the portable easel is not something that they had.
Okay.
The up until this point, the easel was a heavy fixture within the studio. And second of all, mixing paints is something messy. You have to grind some pigments down. You'd usually get your assistants to do it. And if you wanted to transport it, up until about the 1840s, the easiest way to do that was using an animal bladder.
Oh, God. What a mess.
Well, the paint tube is invented in the 1840s in London. And so again, if you want to take your easel out to the countryside, it's a lot easier to do that with tubes of paint as opposed to a bunch of sheep's bladders.
Yeah, that's fair.
So that the image of the Impressionist artist going out to nature and drawing something like this, it's something that couldn't have happened earlier on in this. That this is very much something that happens in the Industrial Revolution.
Technology has enabled this.
Mm-hmm. Another huge difference, I mentioned it before, this is the age of photography, so the king doesn't need to commission a dramatic painting every time there's a battle won or a battle lost. They just send somebody out to take pictures of it. So, overnight that kind of painting becomes obsolete. There still is some demand for portraits, but by and large, the artists start to say, if you want something photorealistic, use a camera. We're going to just do this stuff with the broad brush strokes. It's not necessarily realistic, but again, 50 years earlier in England, Turner was doing that. The other major change at this point is it's also a result of having a large middle class who can afford to buy this stuff. If you're commissioned to paint something for the king or for the church, you're going to be painting a gigantic painting that's going to take up the whole wall. If you're painting something for a merchant to put over his fireplace, you can paint something, a couple feet by a couple feet.
A little more affordable size.
Yeah, exactly. They could paint smaller paintings. That's another thing we take for granted, but that comes out of this period as well. So again, this story of the Impressionists changing the art world, were they really changing the art world, or was the world just changing around them? Yeah. I think it's the latter.
Yeah, that seems more reasonable.
Yeah. The group of people who become the Impressionists, a couple of them had gotten into the academy when they were young, but this is the time when this middle-class market for art is big enough that people can start skipping that process altogether. Okay. Previously you had to do something to impress the academicians. In theory, that was you had to impress them with your art skills. I know how the art world works. Yeah, I'm sure there's other things they had to do.
Some things never change.
The academicians would admit some students. They would allow them into salons because the academicians were also the jury for the salons. The successful painters would get a few government commissions, and if you're good, they would allow you to become an academician yourself. That's just the way things had been done up until that point. But now that you have a new market of middle-class people trying to buy paintings, if you had any artistic talent, you didn't necessarily need to go that route anymore.
You go direct to the consumer.
Yeah, just like Spotify nowadays.
Yep.
Before I even say much about Impressionism, you see that all this talk about revolutionary art, it's being explained away. It has.
Yep.
Don't listen to any pretentious historian telling you about how the Impressionists changed everything. They didn't. They were just reacting to their time, just like everybody else does.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Why didn't we create podcasts in the 90s? Because there were no podcasts in the 90s.
You needed thousands and thousands of dollars worth of specialized equipment that you didn't know how to use.
Yeah.
You couldn't just YouTube tutorial or Google how to use it.
But you'll notice something, though. We talked, for the entire last episode, we were not able to define art. We talked about England. Why did we talk about England? Because we said our idea of art was completely associated with the English Royal Academy. In fact, to the point we couldn't really disassociate our concept of art from this institution and this cultural context. If we apply that definition of art to France, so that the French definition of art is completely tied up with the French Academy as well, if these artists are starting to work outside the Academy and going direct to the consumer, does that mean the definition of art is changing?
I guess the landscape changed, like an evolution.
Yep.
Right? This can survive now. There's funding for this.
Like I said, I just don't think you can call these people revolutionary. They weren't the ones tearing down the Vendôme column the way Courbet does. You could go down the list of the famous Impressionists. Degas, he was just a rich kid who hangs out with people who could afford his paintings. Renoir, he was an Impressionist for a few years, and later on in life, he actually goes more of a classical direction. Monet, as best as I can tell, he spends all of his life painting stuff like the painting you have on the screen right now. It's a nice painting, but as best as I can tell, he just likes doing this.
Yeah.
I don't think he's trying to really smash any barriers by doing it.
Yeah, it is what it is.
Yep. He's just really good at painting water and steam and smoke and clouds and all that stuff. We all have gifts in this world, and this is Monet's gift, is just this specific kind of painting.
It's always nice when someone finds, what they can do.
So we're just going to take a quick look at some of the big names of the Impressionist era, and I just need to reiterate, these are the first real cohort of artists whose paintings appear in Ferris Bueller. I hate to say, just like I said, the definition of art is changing. Whatever art becomes is almost synonymous with a bunch of American art galleries that appear in 80s movies.
Yep.
It just is. This is Renoir. He painted people a little bit more than landscapes, but again, you see the broad brush strokes. The background is faded. There's not
not detail.
Yeah, there's not. It still gets the point across. It's still kind of nice looking, but
Definitely
it's yeah. This is Degas. He liked to paint ballet dancers. Now, the official story about Degas is that he would play around with people's body positions and proportions to make some sort of a point. Again, I know artists. I know why an artist would be spending his time in ballet studios.
Yeah, nothing good's coming from that.
You'll notice this is London, not Paris. Like I said, Monet, he fled the country during the Franco-Prussian War because he didn't want to end up facing guns on the battlefield. And remember, he enjoyed working with like smoke and clouds. Being in London actually worked out really well for him because London's known for its fog. And, again, it's not the most detailed painting. It's probably not what I would have paid the most money for, but it certainly does get the Thames River across. London does look like that.
This is the feel. It gets the feel of London across.
Yeah. And this is Pizarro. He went to London as well during the Franco-Prussian War. And, you think of Impressionist painting as be using bright colors and everything, but that's because it was painting France. This is just a suburb of London, but I think it gets the feel of London across.
Yeah, absolutely. This is like, you can get the kind of
the
quaintness of certain parts of England.
Yeah. As the story goes, in 1874, all these independent artists outside of the academy, they got together and had an art show of their own. They called themselves the Société Anonyme des Artistes Peintres, Sculpteurs, Graveurs, etc. So the Anonymous Society of painting artists, sculptors, engravers, etc. Not the most catchy title. Pizarro, he is the unofficial leader of this group. He said, fuck the academy, we're doing things our own way. I'm sure these kids all had trust funds, but that's just the art world, right?
Yep.
And this painting here became the most famous painting to come out of that art show. Not because people said it was beautiful. No, the art show was panned by the critics. Everybody said, what the fuck are these people doing? This painting here, it was called Impression Sunrise by Monet, and that's where the term Impressionism comes from.
Okay.
Now, what really is Impressionism? Impressionism is broad strokes and bright colors. Again, it's supposed to be done quickly. It's supposed to be your first impression of a landscape or of a person. Who cares if it's not completely realistic? But almost none of the Impressionists would ever use black in their paintings.
I noticed, but yeah.
Why is that?
Black ink is more expensive.
No, it wasn't that. In the academy, in the quote-unquote proper way of doing things, there was a way of drawing shadows. You were trained to do shadows a certain way, and you would use grays and blacks to do that, because that's what shadows look like in the real world. The Impressionists, especially Monet, when they needed to draw shadows, they would often use a contrasting color instead of, black or gray. If you were, I don't know, painting something blue and you needed to have a shadow, you'd use dabs of orange for it. Was it realistic? Of course not, but it didn't need to be. So that's what Impressionism is. We can argue all day long about whether this art is as aesthetically pleasing as the classical paintings done within the salons. That's an argument that you can spend a lifetime having. But there's another huge development in the art world that we need to talk about, and that's the art dealer.
Oh.
Because at the end of the day, there were a lot of crazy artists in France.
Yeah, that's artists of all types are not well people generally.
Yeah, especially in Paris. Why were the Impressionists the ones who became famous and had their art hanging in the gallery in Ferris Bueller's Day Off? It's because there was one art dealer named Paul Durand-Ruel who decided that he was going to sell all these Impressionist artists. And he did not have a lot of success selling them in France.
Okay.
He did have a lot of success selling them in America.
There we go.
I know it's taken me like 3 hours to get to this point, but I had to reach here eventually. Why do we focus on art like the Impressionists? It's because that art sold in America.
Okay.
There was lots of other art going on in France, and like I said, I'm sure it's hanging in the Louvre, but France was not the world hegemon of the 20th century. The United States was.
Okay.
And again, just as Proudhon and Baudelaire were crucial to the story of art in the 1840s and 50s, even though they weren't artists themselves, Paul Durand-Ruel is probably the most important name in art in this period, and he wasn't an artist. He was not an artist. He was an art dealer.
Okay.
He had a famous quote, said, "The French people laugh and the Americans buy." Some things never change, right? Another thing that Paul Durand-Ruel really promotes is the idea of the solo exhibition. He told the Impressionist, other people in the stuffy art community are laughing at you. Why don't you just put on your own art show? We take it for granted that a bunch of pretentious artists do that now. This is completely new at the time.
Yeah, nobody had thought to do their own thing with blackjack and hookers.
Yeah. So, why do I say this? Because all of this talk about the Impressionists, yeah, some of this art is kind of pretty. I'm not going to say it isn't, but everything from the kind of paintbrush to the changes in Paris to industrialization to art dealers being able to sell stuff in America to solo art exhibitions, none of that really has anything to do with what the paintings look like.
Yeah.
But in this period, that completely changes the art world.
The medium is the message.
Yeah. You can talk about the history of art in this period, which is considered one of the most important periods in the history of art, and you don't need to talk about the paintings at all.
Changes around it.
Whatever art is, whatever art becomes, just as art in the 1700s and 1800s was defined by Britain and British institutions, art in the 20th century is going to be defined by American institutions. And so it's only natural that they're going to say the pioneering art was the art that somehow ended up in America at this time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So, not to say that art history professors are full of shit, but they're full of shit when they talk about this art movement moving to that art movement, moving to this one, moving to that one. No. This art just went to America and nothing else did. This art survivorship biased its way into American art galleries.
Whatever the French don't sell, I send across the Atlantic.
Pretty much. So you even have a number of American artists at the time who decide that they want to do Impressionist type paintings. People like Mary Cassatt, But American tastes, they stay kind of static until about the 1910s. Like you have people like Winslow Homer who does the seascapes and the landscapes. You have people like John Singer Sargent. In the 20th century, American art just goes completely off the rails, but at least up until that point, American art is still kind of conservative. Yeah, they buy this Impressionist stuff, but they buy the Impressionist stuff and then they start making their own art in the Impressionist style. They don't quite, they don't try pushing the lines of good taste until a few decades later. Now we need to go back to Paris, because that's where this episode is going to end up when things come full circle. Now, to be fair, art goes a lot of different ways in Paris. You still have the Academy and the salons. You have people like Rodin, who, like I said, he did the Thinker, the famous sculpture. But you also start seeing some really weird, unconventional developments as well. The joke about modern art is the person who just hands in a white canvas and says it represents the emptiness.
Yeah.
A guy in France does this in the 1880s. That's again, nothing original about that stuff. Completely derivative. Been done for 140 years. And we're gonna close this episode by bringing things full circle, and that means coming back to this painting here. Now this is the painting from Ferris Bueller's Day Off that is Rich Friend was staring at, the one with all the dots, the one where he was staring at the kid in the middle of it, realizing that the kid's face was not really a face, just a bunch of dots, nothing there.
Yep.
And thinking that he was just nothing himself as well.
Yeah, game, recognized game.
So, we've talked a lot about the definition of art. We said that even the concept of art, not just painting and not just sculpture, the concept of art is something higher. This is an idea coined by Joshua Reynolds, and it really only makes sense in the context of the Royal Academy in England and the Academy of Fine Arts in France and a few other academies. Art is something done within those bounds, and it has an intellectual bent to it. It's supposed to be a form of higher thought. It's also supposed to be an academic activity as well. This idea was retroactively applied to the Renaissance and was roughly the concept that Vasari was describing without using the word art. But it's tenuous at best to use that concept to talk about anything from the Impressionists forward. And the problem is that's the art hanging in a lot of American quote-unquote art galleries. Is it the same concept? I don't know. In the 15th, 16th, 17th century, it was done for the church and royalty. In the 18th and 19th century, it was done for the academies and salons. But from the 1860s onwards, you have a middle class buying these paintings for mass consumptions. And this is when people start asking, is this really art, or is this just like sappy mass-produced shit? Like, would you say that the latest Marvel movie is art?
Not necessarily.
No.
Yeah.
Not in the way that an Alfred Hitchcock movie was.
Yeah, exactly.
No. You start getting this idea of kitsch around this time. Nobody really knows where that word originally came from, but we recognize it when you see it.
From gay people.
Well, a Hallmark card with a nice painting on it and a couple stanzas of a poem. Is that really art, or is that just mass-produced sentimental shit? I don't know. But this question never had to be asked until around the time of the Impressionists, the 1860s, 1870s. And it's awfully coincidental that all of the art in the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off is from exactly that period in time forward. Maybe the concept of art just ended there and became something different afterwards. Certainly the activity that we call art from that point onwards was heavily dependent on art dealers and heavily dependent on art collectors.
The gatekeepers.
Yeah, and that's just, I mean, there were certainly gatekeepers before. They were just a different set of gatekeepers.
The royalty, or whoever, the church.
So maybe from the 1860s onwards, maybe from the Impressionists onward, whatever we call art is just a completely different endeavor. Maybe it's not even art at all. Certainly, there are no guardrails from that point onwards to stop modern art from becoming whatever the fuck it is now.
Yep.
So, in the next episode, we are going to really look at how the aesthetics went off the rails in the 20th century, but let's just end this episode by taking a look at this painting. It's the focal point of a famous 80s movie after all. It's a Sunday afternoon on the Isle of La Grande Jatte. It's by Georges Seurat in the 1880s, in 1886. It's called pointillism. Like I said, it's made out of a bunch of little dots, and as you stare closer at it, you realize that all of the edges just start disappearing. You kind of have to look at this from a distance for it to make sense. Like I said, if you watch the DVD of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, John Hughes says it's something about Cameron having daddy issues. As it is. This is a movie where the whole premise is you're supposed to feel sorry for a kid whose sister got a car when he only got a computer.
Yeah, this is freaking very strange.
What's the real story behind this painting? In a very real sense, this painting marks the end of Impressionism. Painters would still make paintings in an Impressionist style. So what do I mean by it's the end of Impressionism? Well, the Impressionists, that group of the Society of Anonymous Painters, they had 8 exhibits between 1874 and 1886. You know, they were the cool avant-garde people who are selling our art in America. This painting here was one of the centerpieces of the last of these Impressionist shows. It was in the 8th and final one in 1886. And what's with the dots? Is that some sort of pretentious social commentary? Well, no, it isn't. So the artist, Seurat, he's a guy we don't know very much about because he dies very young, and he lives a very private life as well. He's a spurg.
There we go.
Remember, the Industrial Revolution is still going on at this point, and one of the big changes is that textiles are now made in factories. And so you get new dyes and new pigments all the time, new ways of making paint. You even get a bunch of new scientific papers coming out about new ways to make color. We take it for granted now, but this was completely novel in the 1880s. This spurg named Georges Seurat, he decides he's going to be meticulous with all of these new scientific theories. One of which is that you can make colors seem bright by using contrasting colors in small amounts, embedded. There was a chemist named Chevreau. He was studying why some dyes seem brighter than the others, and he made diagrams of like a bunch of little dots, which clearly Seurat studied. It's easy to see where those dots came from. And he just decided he was going to painstakingly use all these scientific theories to make a painting with all these dots.
Jesus Christ.
Now, before you ask, yes, Seurat was a rich kid who never had to work.
There we go.
Most of the Impressionists, they were at least middle class growing up, but some of them did have to work to put food on the table, and some of them had to learn their skills from artisanal labor. Like Renoir, he as a young man worked painting ceramics, so he had to earn his skill that way. But Surratt, he just had rich parents who sent him to one of the top art schools in the country. He apprenticed for a couple of classical artists, then dropped out because he said, I don't want to do this. I want to do scientific painting.
It's a rabbit hole people go down sometimes.
Yeah. So he uses his trust fund to make art in this really meticulous style, and this work is his masterpiece. It's shown at the final Impressionist exhibition. But it's very different than the happy-go-lucky, bright colors, big, wide brush strokes. The image, whether it's true or not, of the painter in the beret setting up his easel by the river and painting something, that's not what this is. This is a guy who had a lot of time on his hand, who literally made every dot a color based on his scientific theories.
Weird. It's like a Scientology painting.
Yeah, like kind of, yeah.
The Battlefield Earth, the fucking paintings.
Well, hey, again, it is an interesting painting. I think it does have some aesthetic value. Battlefield Earth most definitely didn't.
It had comedic value.
Yeah, it did. So, if this is what the Impressionist shows are starting to exhibit, then maybe Impressionism has just become something else. Just like, hair bands and grunge and acid rock and whatever, things have their shelf lives, they run their course and they become something different, and this painting was just an indication that Impressionism had run its course and people were moving on to different things. Surratt, he doesn't live very long. He dies at the age of 31. After he does this painting, he's completely burnt out, so he keeps doing these pointillist paintings, but he makes them very, very small. And again, smaller paintings are for bourgeois audiences, so he paints things like can-can dancers, nightclubs, circuses. Even in this masterpiece that we have on the screen, it's been debated by a lot of museum curators and stuff, but there's a lot of them think that a lot of the women in this painting are women of ill repute.
Yeah, I can see that.
So, how much of an effect does Surratt have on art in his own day? Well, I'm not going to say he doesn't have any. Like I said, he exhibits at the last of these famous Impressionist art shows in 1886, and that's the year when at least one other artist who had his career cut short by an untimely death, that's when Vincent van Gogh comes to Paris.
Oh!
And again, nobody cares about Vincent van Gogh in his own day. After he's dead, people talk about him like he's the biggest tortured genius ever, but nobody gave a shit about Vincent van Gogh in his own day.
For millennials, nobody gave a shit about Vincent van Gogh until that Doctor Who episode.
Yeah, fair.
That's the sad truth of that.
Now, how was Van Gogh affected? Well, in 1886, he comes to Paris, spends a couple of years. We must have seen this painting because it was exhibited the year that he was in Paris. Just take a look at what happens to his painting.
Yeah.
Don't tell me that wasn't affected by the idea of being meticulous about your color and mixing every dot and dash.
Yeah. Oh, you can definitely see the influence, especially in the right
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah. Well, the one on the left is before.
Oh,
this is before he came to Paris, and that was afterwards.
Okay.
I mean, Van Gogh. Yeah, we talk about him as being the tortured artist. He spent his 20s in England failing at a bunch of jobs. I think he wanted to be a preacher for a little while. He sucked at everything. Yes. then his brother was an art dealer. So if you want to get into the art world, it really helps if your brother is a gatekeeper in the art world.
That it does.
He ends up in Paris in 1886, spends 2 years there, decides to move to the south of France.
He keeps letting prostitutes move in with him.
That he does. Oh, that was when he was in Paris. Yeah, totally. Yeah. He decides that in the south of France he's going to start an artists collective, which means, Vincent, are you just lazy and don't want to pay rent?
Yeah.
Well, what does that have to do with anything?
And certain universal features of artist collectives, unfortunately.
He's clearly influenced by whatever, maybe not by Seurat personally, but if that's the way that art is going in Paris, that's what he does. I think of the self-portrait on the right as being like a movie like A Scanner Darkly.
Yeah, it looks
just stylized for its own sake. And that brings us back to Ferris Bueller and his friend Cameron in that art gallery in 1986. It probably wasn't even a conscious decision, but there's a reason that scene worked as well as it did. John Holmes says during his DVD commentary that he knows that scene is self-indulgent because he wanted to show off all the art that he knew in that gallery that he went to when he was a kid. And that art is for bougie people.
Yep.
It was for bougie people from day one who wanted to just be different. And the scene worked as well as it did because Ferris Bueller was the target for that art.
Yep.
He was the target for that art in the 1880s. He was the target for that art in the 1980s.
Yep.
He wasn't just some rich ne'er-do-well who had a secret appreciation for the arts. He was exactly what that art was supposed to be made for.
Yep.
And so we've seen painting and sculpture be at the center of Vasari's Chronicles of the Renaissance. We've seen painters have special status with kings and popes. In the 1750s, Joshua Reynolds insisted that the paintings produced by the Royal Academy were on par with philosophy made at Oxford. We've seen art moved from the royal court to the salons and exhibitions. And from here on out, it just degrades. And we're going to look at that whole process of degradation in the next episode.
Wow.
So this episode's gone on long enough. We're going to end it there.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at kofi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.